everybody enjoyed probably one of the most healthy lunches I've ever had at these type of banquets because it was, I mean, it was wraps and quinoa and all kind of things I couldn't pronounce out there, but it was great. It was delicious. But thank you all for sticking with us throughout this day. This Thought Leadership Summit, if we ended right now, it would just be a total success. But we've got two more fantastic panels for you. Georgie snaps like we're doing it. We're poetry reading, snaps. Okay, make sure everybody says, thank you so much for the person in the front. Checks are coming. So as I told the table here, now that we fed you, you are contractually obligated to stay for at least one more hour with us while your food digests. And we have a fantastic panel with our beloved Dr. Gigi coming up, and our newest friend, Dr. Jeff Menzies. And I'm not even going to give it away because they have something special to share with you all here today, because the title of their panel is Black Men Hurt Too. So we're going to talk about mental health, and we've got the two best people that I can think of to come up and talk about it as we have this third panel. So continue to enjoy the refreshments. I think they're still out there, water, and just really sit back, relax, and listen to these wonderful speakers talk about mental health.
Thank you. Thank you.
Test.
There we go. Good afternoon. Great. It is hard to come back after you've eaten lunch.
We got a serious task.
For those of you that are here, please encourage your friends, colleagues to watch this later. It is being taped because I think that I'm going to learn a lot from Dr. Menzies, but I think it is a conversation that we really need to have. So let me just, oh, okay, I'm up there. Gigi El Bayoumi, and earlier when I spoke, I did not give the proper shout out to BDO. BDO is just a terrific organization. The kinds of programs that are done, including this one, I think are terrific. The growth of the sorts of programs that are on there has been incredible. I actually have a number of my former residents who are now doing shows on healthy eating, weight loss, among other things. So I'm on the medical advisory board for BDO. So please continue to support this wonderful organization. And for the funders that are out there, you are getting a lot of return on investment. So this fireside chat, we hopefully will be having a young man join us shortly. He's coming in from Baltimore and he's a bit delayed, but Black Men Hurt Too. So before we get into the topic, I have to pull up this young man's CV because, and if all I did was read all of his accomplishments, we would not have time to talk. But Dr. Jeff Menzies is a dear friend. He's an associate professor at the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State. He graduated from both Fisk and Howard University, receiving advanced training and degrees in clinical psychology. He was the former director of the Academic Success Center at Fisk. And he really, let me just jump to it. Dr. Menzies has published 10 books. He also has a podcast, but what's most important is that he's real and that he can talk about this very important issue that really helps to bring it up, to get more understanding, and he can talk to any audience, any audience. So with that, Dr. Menzies, I want you to kind of go to the title of this, Black Men Hurt Too. Tell us about it.
First, I want to thank you, Gigi. Appreciate you. I'm not paying Gigi, by the way, okay? I might need to start paying you.
No, you do not have to.
Thank you.
You're all that.
Appreciate you, sis. I want to thank you for the invitation. And also, BDO, thank you all for hosting this event and for the warm welcome that I've received. And definitely all of you all sticking around after lunch. we're up against some good food here, so we
Hey.
got to make sure we get it going. But the Black Man Hurt Too. The title itself, I can't take credit for it, but it does speak volumes to, the experience of invisibility that many Black men have. And you would think not, because a lot of the narrative is that, we are, the dominant force on the scene and all those. But when you look into politics, you look at health indicators, when you look at life expectancy, you see the Black men are actually losing big time, employment rates, poverty, we're losing big time. And so when you talk about Black Men Hurt Too, the two part is saying also like, hey, let's pay attention over here. Because, if anybody in the family unit is hurting, that means the entire family unit is hurting, and you can't leave one out. And oftentimes men feel, perceived or real left out of some of these conversations. And so I've of late, have been advocating on that side and really just trying to deliver the message that, because we speak about men's issue does not mean that we are avoiding or negating other issues, and so it's okay to talk about men's issue as it relates to men in isolation.
I think, one of the challenges is that given racism, sexism, classism, that men do get left out. And yet, men are so integral to the society. One of the things that I learned is that when a father is present in a girl's life, she has more confidence. She's more likely to take risks in a positive way. And the absence of Black men in girls' lives has actually pretty negative consequences. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. And heavy hitting consequences. I mean, you're talking about the idea. So, from a psychological stance, especially developmental psychology, we all hear it, a kind of tongue in cheek statement that we seek out people that are like our parents, so a guy seeks out a woman of like his mother, and girls like their father. And so many of us, we get validation as children from our parents, the present parent and the absent parent. And so a lot of times young ladies will, and even the boys, but we take it differently. We process it differently, and oftentimes it will manifest in different ways. But speaking specifically to your question, young girls, seeking out father and having developed a particular attachment style, and depending on what that experience is of the absentee father or the father that's struggling to be present or the dysfunctional present father, all of those things can impact self-perception. And as you mentioned earlier, confidence. And then it also translates and it bleeds over into relationship issues. That's a whole nother. I'm not going to open that bag of worms, Gigi, but if you do it, I'll go with you. But that relationship conversation is a whole nother thing. But especially nowadays when we see all these statistics about people maintaining virginity into the older years now, people opting out of dating, less intimate partner relationships, less intimate as in physical closeness, with other people. All of this stuff is diminishing, and so what we're looking at is we're on the horizon of a society that's going to be very different than one that we're used to. And a lot of it has to do with the lacking in those relationships.
Let's talk about boys and teens. And I say boys on purpose because boys, Black boys, usually have at least 4 years added to their actual age when referred to in societal discussions. And yet that is really where Black men start. So tell us about what sort of the societal expectations and the societal narrative and the depiction of Black boys and youth and teens and young adults. What does that do to these young people?
I was once asked, what is one of the most important things that for Black boys in becoming Black men? And I said, to survive. Right? And with that understanding, it's like, okay, let's take a step back for a minute. We have to survive. And so much of the imagery, that we're being fed is death. It's death driven. It's drama driven. When we saw the birthday party just the other day, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and 2 teenagers actually did the shooting. I've got a teenage son, and he's like, Bob, can I go to this party? I'm like, so it's the blessing and the curse. I feel like I know too much sometimes, but I know enough to know that I've got to let him have room to move and breathe. But the imagery that's out there, our children believe that this is what it means to be cool, and that being cool, or at least seeming cool, is worth your life sometimes. And so, when we're feeding and constantly pumping these messages to our children, nobody in this room is doing it, although I know we have some marketing experts here, but none of us are the ones that are operating the machine that's actually saying, this is the rewarded behavior. This is the rewarded identity. This is the rewarded mannerism. This is the rewarded label that you carry for yourself, right? I'm saying rewarded in the true, operant conditioning sense of the word, where you give reward. And when something is rewarded, it's more likely to be repeated and or imitated. And so, rewarding is making famous. Rewarding is giving large paychecks and large sums of money, right? For ideologies and presentations that are, again, totally depth driven. And so that to me is very detrimental, as we see, because it puts our boys at risk of not surviving to become men. And, briefly, the story about elephants, where there was a game reserve. And for those who know, I go over really quickly, there was a game reserve in Africa, and they opened up a new game reserve, or a safari place. It's probably not a game reserve, like a safari place. And they were the adult male elephants were too big to transport by helicopter. So they only took the baby
bulls.
elephants.
Yeah, I think they're called bulls.
Bulls, the babies are bulls?
I think so.
All
The
right.
boys.
Baby boy bull elephants. So they hooked them up to helicopters and flew them joints over to another game reserve. They took the adult females to the game reserve as well. And they left the adult male elephants at the other place because they couldn't transport them. And what they noticed is that the young bulls would start to act out. And they were literally killing other animals on the game reserve. And they were like, what's going on here? They didn't act this way back at the other place. And so, through deductive reasoning and some scientific studies, they said, wait a minute, here's what it is. The adult males aren't present. And when the adult males aren't present, these young bulls are no longer in check. And it wasn't just because they were big and bad and I'll stomp you out if you act up. No, it would literally had to do with the hormones that the young bulls would go through. And they would secrete this hormone. They're like going into heat. And when there's an adult male elephant present, it would check the release of that hormone. And so it would maybe keep it down to a certain window of time, if out of the presence of the adult male elephant. But if the adult male elephant showed up, it cut off instantly. And it brought them right back down to level. Transpose that same understanding to our neighborhoods, our homes, and our communities, right? When there aren't enough strong adult men present, then there's that checking force in there. I mean, it's one thing. I know many of us have had that look. We got a mama to give you that look like, and it'll cut that mess off instantly too, right? It's like, off. Whatever I was on, off, right? But it's still not the same thing, right? Holding the father's hand feels different than holding your mother's hand. Being consoled when you're hurting, whether it's emotional pain or physical pain, feels different when it's coming from a mother and a father. And that's why it takes both to create a child, because it takes both to help to raise a healthy child, right? And so, I don't even remember what the question was at this point, Gigi, but for our boys, for our boys to survive,
Yes.
That's the key.
Yes.
And so much of what they're up against is telling them that, one, you're not worthy of survival.
Exactly.
Two, you're not likely to survive.
Exactly.
So get it now. YOLO, you only live once and it's a short time. Get it all right now. And it's a travesty.
And actually, when they've done studies looking at Black boys versus others, they are actually smarter when they're in the 3rd and 4th grade. And then something begins to happen where they are, whether deliberately or not, that's a whole other conversation, they get cut down. And I just want to comment, going back to sort of the experience of AIDS. My mother and I, my mom's an anthropologist, back in the early 90s, we wrote the introduction to the Black Anthropology Journal dedicated to AIDS.
Wow.
And guess what they found, the researchers? That when you talk to Black young men about using condoms, they said, why should I? I'm going to be dead by 25.
Wow.
And so that reality is still there. I mean, here we're talking decades later, and that hasn't. So the point that you've made about survival, but also being valued. If you're not being valued, and so let's talk about the notion of masculinity, because that is a big topic, but it's one that really drives behaviors,
Absolutely.
right? So talk to us.
I was teaching a bunch of doctoral students at a predominantly white institution. It was a seminar on all of the isms. They gave the Black adjunct all the isms. So I was like, I had to show up. I had the one class that covered all of the racism, sexism, heightism, ageism, weightism, all the isms. And the class was majority white females. There were 2 non-white people in the class of 40 some odd people, and maybe 5 males total. And we did good with racism. They got through racism. Surprised. I was like, we did all right with racism. Cool. But I got the sexism. And these are students going to become clinicians, like practicing clinical psychologists. And they didn't realize that ethically as professors, we're not only evaluating how good you did on the paper and the test, but we're also measuring how worthy you are to go out there and claim to be helping people.
Exactly.
Psychology, right? But I had to let them know eventually. So, but what happens is that I made the mistake of saying that men can experience sexism as well. And they lost it. You would have thought that I cussed their mamas out, they kicked their dog across the street, closed down every Starbucks in the hood. I mean, you would have thought I just did some really heinous stuff. And all I did was say that men can experience sexism too. And when I talk about pushback, as a male professor, I didn't even have the right to say that. As the clinician who's teaching them to become clinicians, I didn't have the right to say that. They took me to the chair of the department.
No. Well, yes, because you're Black. Okay, well.
But I'm like, dude, you read my CV, didn't you? You didn't Google me. You think this is going to go good? And of course the conversation did, but that's not here nor there. But it was this idea that I could not even talk about men experience sexism, right? And what you're bringing up in your question is the decline of Black boys, future Black males. King Herod said, kill them before they grow, right? Mary Ainsworth did some studies in Uganda. She has a book called Infancy in Uganda. She was up at Hopkins. And she went over to Uganda and studied, how infants and attachment styles with their parents. And she was like, wait a minute, these infants in Uganda are strapped to their mama's back, but their moms don't have poop and pee-pee running down their back. What's up with these babies that are like 3, 2, 4 months old who can already control their bladders? What do you mean? So it was this idea that, these children are advanced. And sometimes that's intimidating. Somebody told me once that segregation happened or was maintained as long as it wasn't fought to be maintained, because when sitting next to each other, anytime a person is sitting next to somebody who can do something better than them, they run the risk of feeling insecure about their presence. And the presence can become a threat. And when the presence is a threat and the person feeling threatened has power, then they can shoot a little boy through the door and then get out of jail because he's older, but the younger one has to be in a hospital bed, you see? And I think that that's the same thing that's playing out in the classroom, is that, you see people sometimes, they buy these little tigers and these little cute little puppy tigers. I don't know if tigers are puppies, but you know what I mean? The little baby tigers. But they get older and older, and as they get older and bigger, they become more and more of a threat because their strength starts to show up. The defiance starts to kick in, puberty kicks in, right? And I think that that's why it was a study up in New England State. I can't remember which university did it, but they tracked preschool teachers' eyes. And because they were looking at, so who were the bad kids in the room, right? So the teachers were tracking them, they tracked their eyes with some technology in the back of the room. And they were watching the little Black boys, run around the room and play. And all the kids were paid actors, they were actually little people. They weren't kids for real. That was a joke, y'all. It was like, man, they went all out. Like, how did they get funded for that research? Come on, y'all. But no, they tracked the kids and they tracked the eyes, and they noticed that the teachers' eyes were following the Black kids more. And of course, the Black kids had more behavior problems reported. But when you actually watch what was happening in the room, it was about an even kill, right? If not more on the other side, right? And so I think that that's definitely hindering us, and it makes school a source of punishment for us. Learning is not exciting anymore. It's not something that's, we're energized when we're young. We can't wait to learn, reading books, book. Read me to sleep, right? And then it gets to a point to where I don't feel like going to school. I start having stomach aches in the morning. I start leaving class to go sit in the nurse's office. I'm okay, but I'm not okay in that space. And when it becomes a source of punishment, any healthy human being whose survival instinct is still intact, you avoid sources of punishment. And you know what that looks like later on, because you can predict the number of prison beds you're going to have in the future based on, 3rd and 4th grade reading scores. Right. And so if you can now manipulate those reading scores by manipulating the individuals who you're testing, and then manipulate the person who's actually administering the test, then what you have is you have a self-fulfilling prophecy of sort, or a heck of a marketing scheme. Okay, that's a heck of a business plan. It's like, okay, you're telling me that if I can, I'm sorry, Gigi, if I'm rambling.
No, you're not rambling. I think there's so much that you are saying, and it's so rich. And I think that with this audience in particular, what you're saying is resonating so much. And I just love how you're also bringing sort of the research and the science into this. But tell us what you meant by sexism against men. Can you elaborate?
Yes.
In 3 sentences or less.
Okay. Yes, I can. Yes, I can. And yes, I will. Well, I can name a few industries where men get their butts kicked consistently. family court, divorce court, which might also be family court, but it's another division, right? And where else can I say? In the school system, you know, school to prison pipeline, incarceration, that whole industry there. And you know, to me, that's an aspect of sexism because it's being unfairly treated because of your sex, you know, because you are a male. And it happens, it's pervasive. I'm sure if I polled the room, you know, people would tell the truth about it, you know, tell the truth, shame the devil. You know, we would be able to talk about real life stories where men have suffered in these particular areas and how it's not only overlooked, but then somehow it's flipped and men are also the problem at the same time. You know, so you talk about victim blaming, you know, and so I think in those three areas, are three major areas where men suffer big time.
Well, that's why Black men hurt too. But how does hurting manifest in Black men or in men in general?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Anybody watch that TV show, Mind Hunters? Oh, thank you. Okay, I got one of them. You know what I mean?
Is it good? Is it worth watching?
Ooh,
okay, all right.
It's excellent, you know, not a paid advertisement, but it's, I mean, sis, did you notice how in the series when they're interviewing a lot of the serial killers, about serial killers, and they're profiling serial killers?
When the whole FBI was developed, going back to the early late 60s type of.
Yep, they like the origins of profiler
The behavior analyst unit, how they developed.
of the FBI.
Just like a lonely night, started one person by himself.
And then it evolved into a way of interrogation to this point, right? Did you notice how a lot of the psychopaths or the serial killers, this is where the term serial killer came from, was during this process, were actually abused by their mothers?
Yes.
Like a lot of them, that's the backstory on a lot of them, and their victims end up being women a lot of times as well. There's a book called For Your Own Good, and it talks about how corporal punishment actually turned, so they profile like 4 notorious people in history, one of which was Hitler. And they talked about how he was abused as a child, you know, by his mother, and how he transposed his feelings for his mother onto the Jewish people, you know, in Germany and throughout the world. And that's how he was able to rationalize lashing out in the way that he did. And so the way that it shows up, Gigi, just very directly, is that it can show up as an insecurity. On one level, it can be very insecure. You can have stunted or arrested development to where, you know, we got this concept of baby boy, you know, or nowadays they call them F boys. I'm not going to use the actual term, but F boys and baby boys, which are, you know, stunted growth, you know, men who haven't developed fully. It can sometimes turn into what we call hypermasculinity, which is actually compensatory behavior when you're compensating for that same sense of insecurity. But it could also be hypomasculinity. And hypomasculinity is not effeminacy. It's not being effeminate. Hypomasculinity is the lowered drive, the muted assertiveness, the muted aggressiveness, right? The muted, you know, and when it's just muted, it's turned down a lot, you know, like low T, right? There we go. You know, blood panels, you got low T, you're lethargic, you're not really a go-getter, you know, you fall behind, sex drive is down. So those types of things. It can look like any one of those things, but it can also look like aggression. It could look at, you know, black on black violence is driven by it, you know, in a lot of ways. But those are just some ways that it shows up.
Well, certainly in terms of depression, in my experience, men in general can present more with irritability and being withdrawn and aggressive. And so it's more likely that their behavior gets criminalized, right? But also that impacts on their interactions in family, in partnerships, but also at work and society in general. So what can we do to support the men in our communities? Because there is a lot of hurt, there is a lot of suffering, and you know, we can take it back to slavery and understand the emasculation of that, right? But the shackles are still there.
Absolutely.
Right? They may have changed from, you know, metal ones to electronic ones, but and the mental, of course, which is the biggest one. But what can we do in a positive sense?
I think one of the first things necessary on this healing process, because this is a healing process, and we're not just healing men, we're healing our communities.
Exactly.
Is to stop pathologizing manhood. Right now, manhood is a pathology, right? We have things like man spreading. You know, I was accused of man spreading once on the train.
Can you explain what that is? Just how you're sitting, right?
Yeah, you see, I'm sitting now. It's like, you know,
as opposed to me.
Right. I ain't up here like, you know, double cross legs. And I'm like, but there's this concept of man spreading that says that men and all of our arrogance take up more space than what we're supposed to have. And it's not a man saying that about other men, you know, and because a man would understand, well, no, that's basic anatomy. Thanks, man. Thank you, brother. I won't quit my day job, I promise. But it's basic anatomy. And it's just what it is. But we pathologize. And there, I mean, we're not victims as men. We're not victims. But there is an attack on manhood right now that makes us have to tiptoe and walk on eggshells. Y'all, sisters, y'all notice that men aren't necessarily holding doors anymore? You notice how like men aren't necessarily approaching anymore or trying to holler
Yes.
at you, and you know, not even looking at you as you walk past. It's like no. We turn into Stevie Wonder and Ray Charles these days, and a part of that is because of this attack, and it can be very, very costly. And don't be considered a provider because then you have to walk extra carefully. Like this conversation we have with Gigi, if you wasn't sitting up here with me, I wouldn't be having this conversation right now because I could just say Gigi asked the questions, and y'all ain't gonna you can't get canceled, Gigi. So I'm with you. I'm good.
Oh.
But it's even you have to be very careful these days, right? And I think that we have to, as I stated, stop pathologizing manhood and really just understand. Like, yes, there is a such thing as toxic, behavior. Y'all thought I was gonna say toxic masculinity, right? But even the pairing of those two words creates this idea that something about masculinity is pathological. When masculinity is what it is, none of us created masculinity. It's not a social construct. I say it's testosterone driven. Mm-hmm. People say, what is masculinity? It's what testosterone produces. And it's as basic as that, from my understanding. Of course, you got all these different social expressions of it, but if you manipulate the testosterone, you get a different type of behavior. You increase it, you got a certain type of behavior. You decrease it, you got a certain type of behavior from the same person. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that's what it's driven by. But there was a point in time to where we needed masculinity differently than what we need it now. Yep. So we didn't have 15 deadbolts on our door. So you wanted the big masculine person seen coming in and out your house all the time because it kept other folks at bay and say, you don't run up in that house. Why? Because that's where Big Bob is. Right. And I watched Big Bob cut trees down with his bare hands. He's just chopping trees, and you don't mess with Big Bob. Right. But at the same time, if there's a house that's vacant of that, then people would be more likely to run into it. But now we got Ring cameras, we got all kind of security and stuff that makes masculinity in the way that it was no longer as necessary. So now now it seems to be expendable. And anything that it was in the way of is now saying, yeah, we're going to expedite you getting out of here so that we can go ahead and move to the front. Whatever that is, or whoever it is, whatever it is, right? But I think that stop pathologizing masculinity and recognize it to be an honorable expression that came with the universe, just like everything else that came with the universe. And if we can honor it on that level, and we can balance it out, because of all the insecurities, when you have a high testosterone mixed with insecurity, you got a dangerous situation there, right? And so that's what you find when you look at a lot of the mass shooters. You find that these are what self-proclaimed or other proclaimed what they call incels. Y'all heard of incel, which are involuntary celibates, who are men who are, interested in sexual engagement, but cannot. So hence the involuntary part of their celibacy. And it leads to a lot of frustration, especially, and they're in the teenage years most of the time, teenagers and young 20s. And so that's, testosterone is raging, but they have no functional outlet for it, no acceptable outlet for it, except for the guns that they use. Right. And Dr. Frances Wells, and I shut up after this, Dr. Wells, and she recognized that the gun was once called the great equalizer. And so you say equal to what? And so she would draw a diagram. She was a psychiatrist, world-renowned psychiatrist. And so she would draw a diagram of a gun, the profile, sideways. So you had like this. And she would say the barrel of the gun was like a penis. And then, the chamber to hold the bullets, if it's a revolver, like the testicles holding the sperm cells. And so she would say, so what is the great equalizer to? And she said the genetic potential of men to reproduce, right? And so the bullets represent the sperm cells, the barrel of the gun represents the penis, and it ejects it and it takes life, right? As opposed to producing life. And so she did a very deep symbolic breakdown of what the gun was about. Can you tell
us her name again, please?
Yeah, Dr. Frances Welsing. That's actually one presentation was on last night. I had to go leave and talk about was her. Yeah, right? She passed away a few years ago. But when you look at that and you look at the compensatory action of school shootings, if you look at it from that lens, then they get the biggest guns possible, right? The AR-15s, the assault rifles, that shoot bullets at a velocity like the other ones do. They create so much damage. And it's because they feel that they are sexually repressed,
Mhm.
sexually oppressed, involuntary celibates. And so they get the biggest gun possible to shoot the biggest bullets possible, at the highest rate possible to compensate for their diminished sexuality.
Wow.
It's a heck
So
of a
just
process.
think about that for a second.
Just for a second.
So you were kind of joking about me canceling, or not being canceled,
Yes.
and you then able to answer. Let's talk about how, whether it's society or system, whether deliberately, which I think it is, pits
Mm.
men and women within the Black community against each other, and how can we really stop that? And what is the role of a woman in supporting you and not have you get canceled?
Ooh, Gigi. The pitting of men and women against each other, specific to the Black community. When you look at going back to the plantation that you mentioned earlier, it was necessary to disrupt any sense of healthy relationship between men and women, especially when you were seeking to subject them to enslavement, to the point to where you literally were forcing. I mean, Maryland was one of the largest breeding states in the Union, when it came to enslaved people. And so when you were planning to breed and force this man to impregnate this woman, and then force both of them to give up that child or develop a sense of detachment to where they don't even feel a connection with the child, or they definitely don't express it, and they literally try to suppress it, then you have to have a dysfunction between the two of them in order to get to that point. And it's unfortunate because as prevalent as that was, and as much as we know it to be the case of what happened to us, we still have not received the proper therapy to address it. And we're talking about transgenerational trauma now, right? We're talking about hundreds of years ago. And this, when you were free from the plantation, but you never got psychologically healed. So now we're running around with all this transgenerational, intergenerational trauma, where our baseline stress levels are normal now. Are high. So, like last generation, they might have been low, stress during, stress in utero produces a baby with higher baseline stress, heart rate, all that type of stuff. And then the next generation on top of that, next generation on top of that. And then we're not going to even mention Jim Crow, and the lynchings, everything that happened all the way up until we get to 2023, where people are still being lynched. Where you're going to talk about Sandra Bland, you want to talk about Timothy Rice, talk about his young brother the other day. It's still going on.
Of course it is.
And I think we dropped the ball big time, in the psychiatric and psychological world, when we changed the criteria by which one receives a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I've been pushing this, I've been fighting against this as I saw it coming down the pipe. But you no longer get quote unquote points if you are witnessing a traumatic events on TV or on your phone or through social media like that. They're saying that no longer contributes to the diagnosing of PTSD anymore, unless it's a part of your job. And when I saw that change taking place, I said, well, wait a minute, because it doesn't, just because you change the book doesn't change the reality of the experience of it. Right. But it has been changed. And I've started trying to figure out, because it's as scientific as it is political, right? As most things are. So I said, so why would this change be being made? And the only thing that I kept coming up with is that because we need to no longer give people the reason of being traumatized for whatever behaviors or whatever actions are being manifested from that population. And I said, wow, that's amazing, because now it's criminalized as opposed to being a psychological issue or a mental illness situation. But the pitting of us against each other, it allows for that. It allows for the vulnerability that's necessary, because if you and I are parents and we're at each other's throats, then guess who's vulnerable?
Of course.
The children are vulnerable. So you see marketing and advertising, industries want to get the child as early as possible, right? So they can have a lifelong customer. And so if this industry happens to be any of our pathology addressing industries, whether we're talking about mental health, we're talking about physical medical health, or we're talking about incarceration, which is not, the same type of industry, you want a customer as young as possible. You want the brand to be there. And so if we're too busy fighting, we can't pay attention to protect the one that came from us. And I think that that's what it's really about, what it boils down to.
So the DNA that's embedded, right, and has carried that trauma and still carries that trauma, because I would argue, particularly with the previous administration and with the assault on the Civil Rights Act and so forth, it's actually even more open and more aggressive. I mean, when you're preventing certain books from being read in the schools, that is frightening. And yet, during the civil rights movement, there were healing times. I mean, just I was talking to somebody the other day about rap circles for men.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that these were things that were being done in the community, and largely I would say the faith-based community is a place for healing. But then every time something happens like that, I believe that it is dismantled.
Yep.
So moving forward, how can that be mitigated?
I think pouring more resources into developing competent mental health service providers is one of the number one things. Because we have to demystify what it means, one, to seek mental health services, two, to have a mental illness or mental health issue, and then also what it means to administer those services as well. Because oftentimes we're by the textbook. And so I literally came off the front lines working as a clinician and said, I'm going to go into training more. I'm going to get into academia. I'm going to prepare future clinicians because I can help, just to shift the perspective just enough to where, one understands, like, yeah, you put your mask on first, you might have been drawn into the psychological field because you might got some work to do, right?
Mhm.
Might be the reason, right? Maybe not. Don't think all of us are crazy. But
we all have issues, right?
Every
all
last
do.
one of us. The one that
We all
tells
have
you that they don't is probably the one you need to worry about. That's the one. But pour more resources into just educate. It was stated earlier that that health education, is one of the most important situations. One of the most important situations. One of the most important factors contributing to beneficial outcomes. I think is how it was stated. It's probably stated better than that, I'm sure. But if we do the same type of health education when it comes to mental health, and you teach our children, that no, you have a body, just like if you bump your knee, it hurts. If you hurt your emotions, it's the same thing. We have to take care of that. We have to heal that. And and as parents, learning more about how what we do impacts our children and our future generations. I think that that's really going to be beneficial as well, because we can have emotionally intelligent parents who then raise children who are raised by parents who are emotionally intelligent. I mean, they're going to be less emotionally harmed and scarred, which then gives them an immense amount of support, internal and external, for facing the world out there. So, I mean, I think that those two things, and of course, easier said than done, because with the mind, we don't really have. It's not tangible, right? We have things that are related to the mind that we can point to, like somebody's behavior, but you can't touch the mind. And so in all our brilliance, we attempt to associate it with the brain, but that's correlation.
Yes.
That's if you tell the truth, it's correlation. So we know that when this happens, this part of the brain lights up. This part gets active when you're in this type of exposure, but that does not mean that that's where the mind is. And I was talking to Derek last night. Matter of fact, we talked about time traveling. And we was eating some good apple pie, sipping some tea. It was all sober conversation, but we were talking about how this time travel piece and how the mind is the final frontier, where you can literally like if you all think about what you were doing before you came here this morning, you can really go back to that situation. You're traveling backwards in time now. And often give clients that exercise to see how tangible, time travel actually is within a certain limited experience. But we have to start teaching our children that the mind is very important, and it can be developed, it can be cultivated, and it should be protected. Just like you're careful about what you're eating and put it into your body, you want to avoid the poisons. You do the same for your mind. I think all of those types of things would give us a head start on preventing mental illness, and it's definitely decreasing the prevalence of certain mental illnesses.
Well, I know that this is another interest of yours, whether it's meditation or, what it is that you're eating or being in nature. I'd like to share a story with you. My my niece, she was 8 at the time, and she called me and she said, "Auntie, I smell an electric smell in the house." I said, what did your mother say? She said, "No, whatever. My sister's an artist." Okay, so she's like, and she's also the mother of 5, so that's another aspect of it. So she, kids sometimes say things, I don't say that are not true, but whatever. So I said, "Put your mom on the phone." So I said, "Mona, what's going on?" "Oh, nothing." What do you want me to do?" I said, "Call the fire department." "What's the fire department?" I said, "I don't know." "Call them." Fire department gets there and they said the house would have burned down in 15 minutes.
Ooh.
Okay. Call my niece back. "How are you doing?" And she was still like this. I said, "Okay, what did you learn in peace class?" Now, she goes to a public school here in DC. but it is in Northwest, not in Southeast. So for those of you that don't know the geography of DC, Southeast has 200,000 predominantly African American folks whose median income is about $37,000, as opposed to this side of town where the median income is about 250,000. So I said, well, what did you learn in peace class? And she was crying. I learned that the amygdala is the fight or flight part of my brain, and it alerted me to the danger. And I said, okay. And now that the danger has passed, she said, it's still firing. I said, okay. So what do you do to get it to calm down? I talked to my prefrontal cortex. And so I said, and how do you do that? Mind you, 8 years old.
Beautiful.
8 years old.
Wow.
And she says, I breathe. I said, let's breathe together. And she was fine. But, you know, when you are teaching children and adults for that matter, these techniques, it allows us to feel control, that we actually can self-regulate, not also to mention the importance of science and all that. So for those of us that are not familiar with those techniques, and I want you to actually speak a little bit about the other aspects of what you do in terms of self-care and promoting that with others. So please tell us about that.
Nice. Okay. So Gigi invited me some years ago to do a Heal the Healers retreat. You know, I pitched the Heal the Healers retreat where we were dealing specifically with residents, if I'm not mistaken, residents over
And us and me.
Right. Right. And, you know, just understanding that we pour so much into the people that we are charged with taking care of. You know, we take oaths to do no harm and to help people and all this other good stuff. And rarely do we take the time to turn our healing passion towards ourselves. You know, we kind of get lost in the shuffle. And so part of that is to, you know, just to instruct us to be, you know, aware. Self-awareness is a very important part of that. Your niece, brilliant, you know, brilliant. Her awareness, environmental awareness, self-awareness, environment first smelled it, alerted, didn't stop there, you know, was kind of turned, I hear you. And then, but she went to somebody, you know, brilliant there. But when she went to her peace class and the breathing technique, if you think about your emotional state, almost every emotion comes with a set breathing pattern. You know, anger, you breathe a certain way. Sorrow, you breathe a certain way. If you've been crying, you hardly breathing, you know, it's but it's a breathing pattern for different emotional states. And so what I've learned, you know, through my career, you know, studying meditation and becoming a practitioner and a yoga instructor, all this other stuff, is that you can manipulate your emotional state by manipulating your breathing. And if you think about it, your breathing is one of the few involuntary actions of your body that you can actually manipulate consciously, right? So you're going to breathe without thinking about it. But if you think about it, you can manipulate your breathing, right? And if you think about this, you can go a few weeks without food. You know, I fasted. I got sick back in February. Something jumped on me and I was down for about 4 or 5 weeks. 3 of those weeks I fasted on strictly just water, you know, the whole time. And so you can go a while without eating food. You got a couple of minutes without breathing, right? And so it shows you the importance of breath control in your breathing, but we're under taught about that as a function and how it impacts the rest of our lives. And so what I started doing is I started studying breathing and various aspects of breath control, oftentimes associated with meditation or yoga and things of that nature. And what I found is that, you know, you can regulate your blood pressure. You can definitely regulate psychological states like anxiety, you know, all different emotional states and things of that nature. And the younger that you teach babies, especially when because if it was a baby sleeping, let's say if that was a cot right there and the baby was asleep on their back, how would you know that that baby was breathing? What's moving? The chest is not moving. It's that belly. It's that baby pot belly, right? It's going to expand and it's going to go down, right? And so, but what we're taught as we get older is a chest breathe. We heaving from the chest, but the baby shows what proper breathing is, and that's abdominal breathing. And so what we know is that it's called diaphragmatic breathing. And when you do that type of breathing, you're actually bringing more oxygen into your lungs. You know, the more oxygen you get in your lungs, the more oxygen you can get to your bloodstream, more oxygen you get to your cells, the more energy you're going to have, right? And so we've been taught to breathe incorrectly. But if you start to breathe like babies again, if you teach babies while they're still naturally breathing correctly, how to manipulate their breath and to manipulate their emotional state, then it becomes second nature to them, right? They won't lose sight of that proper breathing, of that very rich oxygenating breathing style. And so we use breathing for various reasons. One of the practical applications of it is I always tell people, like, you know, in a city like DC, you'll mess around and get stuck behind a stinking garbage truck on a 90-degree day in June. Amen. It's happened to me. And I was glad I had my breathing technique down because I saw the truck up ahead. I caught a whiff of it. I said, you know what? Roll up my windows, take a 20-second inhale because you can regulate your breathing down to 3 breaths per minute. Inhale for 20 seconds, hold your breath for 20 seconds, and exhale for 20 seconds. It's doable. More manageable is 5 seconds per breath. So then you turn that into a 4 breaths per minute rate. But I inhaled very deeply, held my breath for 20 more seconds. And by the time I got to the next block, I was able to turn and I was exhaling. So I didn't have to ride behind this truck, right? Taking your niece's situation, you can also regulate your breathing and get out of a smoke-filled building without, smoke inhalation is what kills a lot of people in fires. And so you can avoid smoke inhalation by regulating your breathing. So there are many practical applications beyond, going Zen, right? You can use these techniques to literally, I'm sorry, y'all, this is a alarm because typically I'll be flying at this time. So I just set a regular schedule. But anyway.
Dr. Menzies is actually here from Cincinnati, just so that you know.
Yeah, so that it's just a flight notification. I'm not flying that flight. But anyway, it's the breathing is important. The regulating of the mind is important. And there are a lot of biofeedback technologies now that really help with these things. And I'm one of the ones, I deal with all of these. So I buy all of these different systems. I'm studying these different meditation systems, these biofeedback mechanisms, just because I'm looking for the best way to teach the next generation on how to self-regulate and preserve whatever bit of their health that they could possibly preserve. What's within their reach?
So I'm not getting paid by TM, but transcendental meditation, for those of us of a certain age, we tend to relate it to the Beatles and so forth. But actually, TM is something that is now being taught, and I think it's free in a number of places. But one of the wonderful demonstrations of how effective it is, actually two, is it's been very helpful in PTSD to the point that the Pentagon is actually training vets to do this technique. And it's a technique. It's not a, sort of a philosophy. I mean, you can get into the philosophy, but it's learning how to actually do this technique. The second area is that they implemented it in San Francisco and Chicago, I believe, an all-school TM program. And that's teachers, staff, of course, the students. And guess what happened? 50% reduction in behavioral issues. And of course, I don't know what percent of academic performance. The other thing that they did in Australia or New Zealand is, they've cut out recess for kids. We know this, which is nuts. There, they increased recess to 3 times a day. And guess what happened? Everything calmed down. But there is another aspect to behavior, especially in children. I was speaking to a friend and colleague who is a principal of an elementary school here in Southeast. And she said she could tell which neighborhood the child came from based on his behavior and lead poisoning.
Wow.
So when she was sharing this with other elementary principals in this part of town, he didn't know that lead was a problem. So there are so many aspects to mental health. So I'd like for you to talk a little bit about sort of the ingestions, whether it's food or environment, and how that impacts our mental health.
Yeah, the environment is, one of the number one contributors to negative behavior outcomes. Before I moved to Baltimore and started teaching at Morgan, I wasn't as aware of lead exposure. I have an aunt, my mother's baby sister. She ate a piece of lead paint when she was an infant, and she had developmental delays for the rest of her life and was epileptic. She just passed from COVID in November 2020. But when I moved to Baltimore, I started hearing these commercials on the radio. Is your child acting up in school? It's like a like ambulance chaser type lawyer commercial, but it was about lead exposure. And that was like, wait a minute. So I started studying more deeply lead and how it impacts behavior. And so we did a study at the Institute for Urban Research about the ambient lead in Baltimore. So it's like this ambient lead. It's just in the environment now. And a lot of the houses, being older, opening and closing the windows actually turns the lead paint into a lead dust, and it becomes airborne, right? And so, Freddie Gray, they call it lead check. His family got a lead check. And that's what they call it when your child has been exposed to lead and you get a disability check because of it. And so, when you look at the Sandtown Winchester community, You know, they have one of the highest levels of I forgot, I'm gonna say it incorrectly, but it's about the blood lead levels. You know, it's the proper way to say it, but the blood lead levels are elevated in that community. It's one of the highest communities in Baltimore. And you find that regulated throughout Black communities and all across the nation. Here's the other thing is Hopkins got a slap on the wrist for a study that they were conducting, you know, where pregnant women were in these houses, these particular units, that they knew that they were being exposed to lead, you know. And I mean, you look it up to get the full story yourself, but it was, you know, it was something that just kind of happened. It's oops, sorry.
Well, we can add Henrietta Lacks to that.
Henrietta Lacks, you know, so
And the OBG, anyway, we can go on.
we-
But that's not just, I mean,
right.
I don't want to bash
I know,
one
and I'm not bashing Hopkins,
institution.
so
Yeah,
don't come sue me,
there's-
Hopkins.
I'm sure that there are other untold stories at a number of institutions.
I mean, Harriet Washington, she has that book, Medical Apartheid.
Yes,
You know,
I
you read that book and it's just like, wow, you get exposed to all of the different unethical, you know, sometimes legal, but oftentimes unethical practices. But yeah, so that lead exposure, the whole environment. So what we're ingesting, and think of brother, you asked the question earlier, didn't you, while we were eating lunch about environmental exposure. And so you're talking about what you ingest as far as food and
Yeah, talk
you know,
about that more specifically. I mean, I know that's a particular interest of yours. Maybe
Yes.
let's flip it and say, what are the, I mean, oxidization is a problem, right?
yes.
So what are the foods that really propel that and make it much worse? I mean,
So definitely burnt foods. You know, it's like if you're
burnt.
grilling and you get the
Mhm.
charred on the meat, that helps the
Mhm,
you know free radical production.
mhm.
Anything. Well, here's my philosophy: is that I read labels,
Mhm.
and if there are more than two things that I can't pronounce on that label, I'm probably not going to eat it.
Mhm.
And it's just because I don't know what it is. One, you know,
Okay.
and I don't think I don't need for this strawberry, supposedly strawberry substance to be dyed with something red if it's really strawberries, you know. So I teach the kids that all the time. And again, I'm not, you know, bashing any type of choices.
Sure.
I'm just saying, you know, you want to make as informed decision as possible. So typically pesticides, you know, can create, you know, an environment that helps cancer to develop and grow. Uh, uh, Overcooked foods,
Alcohol.
yeah, alcohol, smoking,
Mhm.
low fiber foods, high sodium foods,
Mhm.
high fat foods, you know, all of those types of foods. You want to do it all in moderation. But you know, I'm not a dietitian, you know, so none of this is medical advice. Seek your licensed medical professional for advice about your diet. But you know what I mean?
Well,
It's
but
just
you know, if we talk about the social determinants of health,
yes,
80% of what contributes to our health, well-being, and life expectancy is not seeing a doctor.
that's right.
It is all of these other factors
That's right.
of the economic health of your community, education,
Yep.
and for food, for mental health. The number one social determinant of mental health is food.
Mhm.
And if you think about it as a survival mechanism, we have to eat even before we worry about housing.
That's right.
But some of from the policy standpoints, because my colleague earlier in the panel was really emphasizing policy. So things like taxes on sugary beverages make a difference. Having regulations on the kinds of stores that are in parts of town.
Mhm.
Southeast, 200,000 people, 3.5 grocery stores.
Mm.
I'm saying 3.5 because I think there's a fourth one that's happened. And then when you look at the quality of food at the grocery stores, I mean, a wilted piece of lettuce or
Right.
a banana that looks like it's on its last leg.
A lot of kids in those communities don't know the bananas start green
Right.
because they always see them just brown,
Right.
and almost rotten.
Right.
Yeah, food
And
deserts.
not to mention the size of the beer cans and the potato chips at the corner stores.
Yeah.
I have never seen as many potato chip brands as I see when I go into Southeast.
Yep.
Why is it that the malt,
The tall
beer,
cans.
the tall cans
Yeah,
are sold there
yeah.
and not here?
Malt liquor, 40
Yeah,
ounces.
although maybe that's changing here too, but I
Yeah.
mean, predominantly that's where policies and laws can help.
Mhm. And even informed consumers, you know, because if people realize, yeah,
No, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at
I saw it too.
time.
People realize that, you know, that they're being played. You know, just
Yes,
to use a vernacular. If you realize you're being played, like, why do you think that malt liquor is here, but if I take you across town, it's not there?
exactly.
What do you think that's about? Why do you think that they have this particular genre of music and artistry promoting these particular things and not the other ones? when people are made aware to that level, then they become more informed consumers, and then they can vote with their mouths and their pockets. We're just not going to eat this stuff anymore. We're not going to drink this stuff anymore. It might be inconvenient for us to try to find a way, but if we come together, we'll charter a bus and get across town to the grocery store with the healthier produce, and we'll come back, and these places have to shut down or have to change.
Well, and let me just tell you, because I think sometimes when people are talking about poorer communities, it's as though nothing is happening, which is simply not true.
Right.
People are farming. They are having lots and lots of initiatives that are there to educate themselves and others.
Yeah.
I learned something. Did you know that under the SNAP benefits or food stamps, you can buy seeds?
What?
And the people who do that actually plant and have enough that they can actually sell. So it's actually a source of income. But I want to come back to education, and then I'll, give you the final word. In Ward 8, only 42% of kids graduate from high school. If all I did as a clinician was to get kids to graduate, that would add 10 years to their life expectancy. So, we will talk about all these other important things that we've discussed thus far and will continue to discuss. But in point of fact, if we're going to be advocates for health, we have to look at these other cornerstones of education, of food, of employment, as well as the social health of a community. So in closing, what do you want us to walk away with from this panel?
Yeah, right. The billion-dollar question. Well, I mean that the mind is very powerful, is very fragile. It's to be respected. We still have a lot to learn about it, and that it colors everything that you do, whether it's the way that you perceive the world or the way you engage the world. And so take care of it as if it's that important. Understand that there are powerful external forces that impact us on a day-to-day basis, and some of which is not always good. And just understand that, you are your first line of defense. When you take care of yourself by what you ingest, whether it be physical foods or psychological stimulation, you want to take care, that you're preserving yourself as much as possible, because we got those of us in the room, we're all, it's one form or another, healers. Whether we're promoting the message of healing, or if we're actually in the OR, we're actually in the office looking at people, and examining people. But as healers, we have to take care of ourselves and make sure that we keep our batteries charged, because if we give so much to the people that we're caring for, we're going to be burned out sooner than later, and then that's going to decrease our efficiency and our effectiveness, and then we end up jacking folks up. So we just got to be very careful. But I mean, those things I think are really good points that I would love to leave you all with. So if you don't remember anything else, just take care of yourselves as you take care of other people.
So do you know why I thought that he was, or I think that he is just an incredible person? I hope you've enjoyed this panel as much as I have.
Thank you, Gigi.
Oh, picture, okay.